On today's podcast, I'd like to expand and talk a little bit about one of the parables or scenarios that Jesus gave to the disciples about wineskin. Um, Jesus was trying to explain to the disciples when they asked, "Well, why aren't we fasting? It's required that people fast, but why are we not doing that?" And Jesus reminded them, well, the purpose of fasting was fasting and praying and hoping and requesting that the Messiah would quickly come to save them from really what they wanted was the Messiah to come to save them from their enemies. But really, what Jesus came to do was to save them from themselves. And so, as Jesus was talking with them, it said, "Well, I am here. The Messiah is here. So if the purpose of your fasting was fasting and praying for the Messiah to come, if I'm already here, what's kind of the purpose?" And so he went on to explain to them that, well, it's like when you make wine. I've never made wine, so I don't know this, but if the people at that time would have, because their water wasn't safe to drink. So they did have to uh, make wine out of the grapes. And, if they just crushed the grapes and made grape juice, and the juice would rot or spoil. But if they fermented it, then it would be preserved. So, anyway, so the story is I think it's made out of goat stomachs, is what they make the wine skins out of, but they would need a fresh one. So I guess they ate the goat and then they saved the goat skin. And then they put the fresh wine they were making, the crushed and pressed grapes, into that. And as it began to ferment, it would bubble and fizzle. And the fresh goat stomach or the wine skin would have the ability to expand. But they could not use the old wineskin after it was used, because after it was used, then it would become hard and brittle. And so if you tried to use it, what would happen is that put in the freshly squeezed juice, and as it began to ferment and bubble and move about, it would put pressure on the container or the goat skin, and it wouldn't have the ability to give. And so it would crack and break. And so what Jesus was trying to explain to his disciples when they were asking, why aren't you asking us to fast? Because that's one of the rules. And Jesus explained to them, I'm here to teach you a better way. I'm here to teach you where your religion of rules has gone wrong. And as we're learning new ways of thinking about God and about religion and about how we're supposed to live among other people. As we're as we're learning these new ways of being, we can't fit that into the old religious constraints of the past. You can't take new learning and try and force it in to old ways of thinking. And so what Jesus tried to teach them was, okay, as we're learning new things, we have to change the containers or the parameters of what we think and believe. So as we learn to follow the true message that Jesus brought to help clarify for the people where they got it wrong. They had all these things about God. If you watch my last podcast, we talked about putting God in a box. God is not in that box. No matter how you define God, or no matter who you are, whether you're right or whether you're wrong, when you create, this is who God is, and this is what God's about, and this is what God says and what God wants and does, you've created parameters. And yeah, you may mostly be right, but the parameters that any human, even a good human, even a human whose theology is near 100% perfect, those parameters for God may not be exactly right. We're trying to get God to fit in a box. And you may have, hopefully, a very large box for your parameters of God, and that's good. But no matter how you define God, God doesn't fit in that box. Anyway, that's kind of a summary of the last podcast. If you didn't watch that, go back and see last week's podcast. Okay, so to start this, I don't always do this, but this time I do want to. I want to go ahead and pull up the scripture, and my current favorite Bible is the NRSV UE, the updated edition, the New Revised Standard Version, which came out, let's see, came out in 2022. The copyright is 2021. Okay. And I want to read this part. I think it's Matthew chapter 9, verse 17. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are ruined. But new wine is put in a fresh wineskin, and so both are preserved. And then while Jesus is sharing that, he gets interrupted with um, a man coming in and saying his daughter is sick and dying. Well, in the Bible here it says that she died. Actually, if you're a fan of The Chosen, this is played out for us in season 3, episodes 4 and 5, I believe. I might be off with those, but uh, I believe I'm correct. I also want to share with you from Beacon Bible Commentary on this particular passage. Now, know that this this story is told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark and Luke were not firsthand witnesses to this, so I always prefer to read from Matthew, especially if it's something that's in all three, because it's possible that Mark actually used the writings of Matthew as his source for writing the gospel according to Mark. Okay, so this is um, Beacon Bible Commentary, and this is the old version. The new ones are very nice, but they're like $1,200, so I won't likely be getting the new ones. This is volume 6, which contains Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I'm on page 101. Jesus gave the illustration that if you had an old garment that needed patching, you wouldn't use brand new material, because then they would have be shrunk at different ways. Same things like when I'm making a quilt. If I use new fabric, then I use all new fabric. Um, but if I'm using a mixture of new and old, I wash all of it just to make sure that it is all pre-shrunk or shrunk as much as it's going to be. Same thing when you make the backing and you sew all the pieces together. Now, one thing you probably noticed that in a quilt, that around the quilting or the stitching, it looks to be puckered, and that's because even if you wash all your fabric first, the thread is probably new thread, and so it might shrink in a different way. In fact, my grandmother made me a beautiful wall hanging in the year 2000 that I hung in my classroom at school. It's now hanging in my dining room here. You probably have seen it. It looks like tumbling blocks. I created the pattern for her, and then she made that, and then she made one for herself, but she used pink and blue instead of shades of gray, so it doesn't quite look like the tumbling blocks as much as my design that she made. But anyway, I had it hanging on the wall a long time, and I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking, that just looks too perfect. It's a quilt. You can tell it's a quilt, but it doesn't have that quilt feeling. And then, after it hung several years, it probably needed to be washed anyway. So I took it and I washed it in the washing machine and dried it in the dryer. Things Granny did not like to do. She preferred to dry them out on the line, and it now has just the right amount of puckering that it has the quilt feeling that I want. So in Jesus is talking to them about things they know. If you have a garment that needs patching, you don't patch it with new material. It has to be material that will go together. And so he talks about then, okay, just like when you're making wine, um, goes into his second illustration of that. The second illustration that was of putting new wine into old wineskins, verse 17. They did not have glass bottles in those days. Instead, they used the skins of goats. The carcass would be removed and then the skin sewn together, except for the neck. One can see goat skins in Palestine being filled with water at a spring. If new wine is put into fresh wineskin, those skins will stretch as the wine ferments and expands. But if new wine is put into old, brittle, already stretched wineskins, there will be disaster. The dry, stretched wineskins will have no capacity for stretching further with the fermentation of the new wine. Instead, they will give way in some place, and both wine and wineskin will perish. The application is clear. The new truths of Christianity must not be poured into the old forms of Judaism. The early chapters of Acts give some hint of the difficulties involved in replacing the old wineskins with the new. Entrenched institutions are apt to be brittle and unable to hold fresh truths. Now, when was the Beacon Bible commentary published? What is this version? Well, I see in here, um, this is one of my dad's set, and it's got, and he always, well, this is my mother's writing, but they would always write their name and the date. So my parents bought this set in March of 1976. And when they went full-time RVing, they were getting rid of a lot of things like heavy books. And uh, I snagged these. So any of my other family ever want to use these, they are here. And this set was actually copyrighted in 1964. So this is a 1964 version. So I was just a little wee boy when these came out. But anyway, so this is um, at the time these were written. We're talking in the 60s, 1964, and the way publishing went before that, it took a long time to get something out. So these were probably written and worked on in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s for these to come out in the 60s. Publishing back then was not as quick as it is today. But the application is clear. The new truths of Christianity must not be poured into the old forms of Judaism. I'd like to change that sentence to make it fit for 2025. The application is clear. The new truths in Christianity must not be poured into the old forms of Christianity. Um, Christianity itself has a long history of missing the mark, missing the point. Uh, we go back 200 years, even the way people that called themselves Christians, the way they treated people who were left-handed. They were of the devil. There was something wrong, and they need to pray and get deliverance and fix your family that brought this evil upon you. Now we think, well, how ridiculous! How could anyone be so stupid? Same thing with slavery, mistreatment of the African people, racism, prejudice was still very much prevalent at the time that those were written in 1964. They were written before that. Those were published. Racism was very apparent in most churches. There are still places in the deep South, I know up in East Texas, where you'll have the Black Baptist Church and you'll have the White Baptist Church. In the city of Nacogdoches in 1969, the First Baptist Church of Nacogdoches had a vote on whether or not they were going to allow black people to be members of their church in 1969. They voted no. And so another Baptist church formed saying that's ridiculous. You have to. And there, when I was a professor at SFA in Nacogdoches, I actually went to that Baptist church that was formed after that vote went the way it was. But you know what? Even in that case, most of the church was white, and they had a partner church out in the country that was black. And, once every few months, they would get together and have the black church and the white church together. So there was de facto segregation, even though they did not have that into their laws. So some of the most segregated places in America today are still the churches. Okay, so Jesus tried to help people see you've missed the point. What you think of God, your box you have of God, is way off. Following all these rules is not the primary focus. And in fact, a lot of the rules written by Moses or any of the leaders after that, and you know what? Even when you get into the Apostle Paul and Timothy, uh, Peter, some of the things they created as things that, yeah, you have to do this. Not all of that actually came from God. You've got that human thing again, putting God in a box and telling you, jump in this box right here with God, because out here is not in this box. And that's not really, really, really accurate. So I have some notes. I want to follow notes because what I found with my podcast, I might have like a 15-minute podcast, but on these topics where I really, really want to stick to my points, I need to make notes. Otherwise, next thing you know, I've gone 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, so I've made me some notes here. Um, that's my end. Okay. So when you look at the parable of new wine and in old wineskins, what that means is you cannot try to fit new ideas, new teachings, or new practices into old rigid systems or mindsets, as they will inevitably break apart, just like new fermenting wine would burst an old inflexible wineskin. Essentially, it signifies the need for adaptation and change to accommodate new things. And I know what some of you are already thinking. Said, well, God never changes. So why are we trying to change things? We can't change God to fit our modern world. No, God does not change. However, our understandings of God certainly do change and evolve, especially when we realize we're wrong. If you don't allow for God to speak to you and guide you and help you make corrections to bad theology, then you are just like the people that Jesus came to deliver with his message of, hey, bozos, you got it wrong. You're focusing on the wrong things. And even at the time, some of the people rejected Jesus as the Messiah because they were ready for the soldier to come in and kill all their enemies. Why did they think that? Because if you look at their history, that's what they believed God did. Killed their enemies when they were being good, and when they were bad, let their enemies take over them. None of that is the way God is. Jesus used this parable to explain why his teachings were different from the strict interpretations of the Pharisees, who were seen as inflexible and resistant to change. All right, think about today. Jesus used this parable to explain why his teachings were different from the strict interpretations of the Pharisees. God is trying to use people right now to explain why God's real message and Jesus' real message is different from their strict interpretations of church theology and church rules and traditional beliefs about the way things are. It wasn't that long ago that in churches, well, actually in the United States, in some states, including Texas, it was illegal for people of different races to be married. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case in 1967 that overturned that. And so now, even in the state of Texas, everybody in the nation, if you're of a different race, you can still get married. So we have strict interpretations. We have traditional ways of thinking about stuff and understanding stuff. And if we are unable to allow God to speak to us and allow us to understand where we're wrong, then we can't change. You can't put new wine in an old wineskin. They will both be wasted. You cannot allow God to speak to you and try and fit that into theology that is flawed. You have to change theology. You can't try and force God to fit in the rules of your church. That's not the way it works. Your church may have rules, but they should be about loving God and loving others and changing the world. If your rules are keeping people out or you're saying things that are not true, then that's not going to work. The new wine in this story represents the new teachings and methods of Jesus, which are dynamic and transformative. You know what the word dynamic means? Changing. The message of Jesus were a change from what they thought and believed. Some of those changes evolved into Christianity like we have today, but it wasn't long until the rules started piling up again. And we're kind of back in the same place where we were 2,000 years ago. Old wineskins represents old established systems or ways of thinking that are not able to adapt to new ideas. Carnal people are unable for even God to speak to them and help them and teach them. If you get to the place where you're unteachable because you know it all, that doesn't work. If you try to force new ideas into old systems, it will result in destruction and loss, just like an old wineskin bursting when filled with new wine. And so, in conclusion, my notes here say, new wine, new witnessing, new way of ministering, new ways of being inclusive to everybody, new ways of thinking will not fit in old containers. Loving new neighbors requires a new paradigm. If you truly are loving your neighbors, the people around you, then there should be representation of everybody in your church. If some groups are missing from your church, why is that? Is it because maybe 20 years ago your church pushed them out? Or do they really not believe the sign out front that says all are welcome here? They don't really believe that. If you're really going to be a person that shows the love of God to all people, then you've got to change you. You can't put God's call on you into your life to love all people if your container here and here contains stuff that does not allow you to love those people. It's just not going to work. Loving our new neighbors requires a new paradigm. Loving our new neighbors requires a new paradigm. You get that? That's the title of this podcast, by the way. Loving new neighbors requires a new paradigm. Now, some of your new neighbors may have always been there. Maybe they're more visible now. Your new neighbors may not really be new, but they're new to you. Getting to know people that you don't think you know, sitting down and talking with someone, knowing them and loving them. You know, God calls us to love people. If you spend time with people, anybody, you will find ways to love them. Now, if you keep them apart and you're never around them and you never get to know them, you never listen to them tell their stories, how are you going to build the capacity to love someone if you're not around them? If you enjoy this type of conversation, or if this type of conversation engages your mind, heart, and soul, then I've accomplished what I would like to accomplish. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my podcast at this YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.